you had a building that was totally rent control and nobody ever moved, you'd be hosed. Like over time, you will get taken out by operating expense.
That sounds like an insane business.
If you can just avoid those, because some percentage of them, you're going to get smoked.
Every morning is like Schrodinger's cat, where you wake up and you are either getting richer or about to be bankrupt. And you just don't know until you open the box. On today's episode of the Real Estate Anonymous podcast, we are heading to the virtue signaling capital of the United States. We're going to dig into a very strange deal, multifamily, San Francisco, rent control, a parking lot that you may or may not have an easement across. Sometimes your tenants can park, sometimes they can't. Maybe your tenants are going to pay you rent, maybe they're not, maybe you won't have anything you can do about it. And we get to the root of how people like myself and our special guest end up in these fields. Is that we like abuse. And every day you wake up and maybe things are going well and maybe they're not. And living on the knife edge is something that keeps you going. So if you are the type of person who likes random sporadic encounters with the government, maybe making your life worse, or perhaps a tenant who wants to assault you and not pay you rent, you're going to love today's episode. Welcome in another edition of the Real Estate Anonymous podcast. Elliot White here with Eric Weatherholt, and special guest Andrew Jeffery is joining us. Brett Moss is not available. He's speaking at some panel in Phoenix. He says it's real estate related. I think it's probably like reproductive strategy and positions and that kind of stuff. Brett seems like an expert in that area.
Imagine having a panel and saying, let's think of the people that we could have on it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people in this country.
There's a ton of people, and somehow you end up with Brett.
And so you have to go through sort of a filtering process, right? You're not going to pick somebody off the street. Maybe you are. But what would the filter go through that you would end up with Brett Moss?
Yeah, I mean, you need someone who is a broker who can take a punch. Someone
well-versed in jean shorts.
Well-versed in jean shorts, obviously. Strong Florida knowledge, perhaps some related ability to wrestle a gator if push comes to shove. A penchant for Mountain Dew, I think, probably makes sense. And then you need someone who's good-natured. And I think that's probably how Brett ends up on your panel. I'd be curious to see if it's recorded, if it's, if we can glean anything from it. I had a revelation. Lots going on with work, nothing really too terribly exciting to talk about on the podcast, but I did find out something about myself last night. I went to buy ski boots. I've been skiing my whole life, and I figured out a little bit of why I'm in the affordable housing business. I haven't bought new gear in 16 years. So all my stuff is just old and beat up. And I finally said, okay, it's time for new boots. And they gave me lots of boots to try on, but the boots I've always worn have been racing boots, which are really stiff and uncomfortable and painful. And I tried on the nice boots first, and they were a little too soft. And I put on these racing boots, and they kind of hurt like hell, and there was some pain. And when I felt the uncomfortable boot clamp down on my foot, I was like, oh, yes. There's like a level of abuse that I like in my life. And I was sitting there in pain with a smile on my face. And I thought, this all tracks. This is how I ended up in affordable housing. This is a horrible, painful way to make money. And yet somehow, as the abuse kind of rolls in, I find myself going, oh, my God, this is great. So I think that says something about me as a person. I don't know if it's
you're on a conference call, like cranking down you got your ski boots on under the desk and you're just cranking them down.
Kind of bite my bottom lip and get ready to talk about coverage ratios. Yeah.
Shorter amortization. I'll take it.
Yeah. Dude, we made an offer on this. This guy, I won't name his name, but he was in like 90 days, he went from the Ernst & Young Real Estate Entrepreneur of the Year to being the cover child for the poster child for like loan defaults and multifamily. And we are looking at some of his deals, and his coverage ratio is of 0.2. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, if you're listening, a debt service coverage ratio is just how much of your money coming in. If your loan payment is $1 million a year, and you have $1 million in NOI, your cover's a 1. You're bringing in exactly enough money to pay the debt, and that's it. Well, his is a 0.2. So for every dollar the lender needs, 20 cents comes from the property and 80 cents is coming from him and his investors, which I don't know how to break this to you both. That's not typically how real estate should work. Like that's not the goal. I don't know if you guys know that.
Oh, you're right, luck, because the deal we're going to look at today would probably make that point too look stellar. So I think
Perfect.
we're in good
Good.
shape.
And this guy had the stones to tell me when I offered to bail him out of his loan, no, I'm not a seller there. I'm like, all right, keep throwing money into the furnace, dummy. I can't help you. Eric, what's new in your world, man?
We got a bunch going on. We've got 4 projects under construction, so that keeps the balls juggling. One interesting thing that I was thinking about that most other property types don't deal with. We're working on we've got an assemblage of properties, and there's one puzzle piece that's missing, not critical, but would be nice to have. And the property is owned by a gentleman that operates a business there. And he thinks he can sell his business. It's a sellable type business, but he's also owns this property. And so it makes it, the business is only sellable if he has a home, and that's sort of a different thing that you see in the retail world, is that the value of your business is also tied to your owning or to your occupancy of a space. So we've been going through sort of a, if we leased him back space and we lowered his rent, he'd have more income to sell with his operating business, or we could crank up the rent. We'd get more value, and he would, but then in turn pay him less for his business. So anyway, it's just I think, in the residential world, the hotel world, the office world, oftentimes the value of the business is not related to, the occupancy of the space. So it's sort of an interesting wrinkle that only in retail are your customers making money off the space that you have, which just makes for a different, it's just a different kettle of fish, which makes it kind of fun.
Do you ever look back at the choices you've made in your life that have led you down this path and think, how did I get here?
And wishing I had some super tight ski boots.
I'll send you some. Yeah. We've got Andrew Jeffery joining us. We're going to talk through a deal that he's bringing. Andrew, new to the pod, thank you for coming on. Can you give people just kind of high level, who are you, what are you doing, where are you doing it, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm happy to be on. As I mentioned to the guys earlier, I think I'm one of the 26 listeners to the podcast. So I've been looking for an excuse to try to wedge myself on for a couple of months now. So appreciate you guys having me. So I was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area. Spent the first part of my career in New York during the subprime boom. So worked on a mortgage trading desk back in the mid 2000s. We were securitizing and selling subprime mortgage bonds. So that business obviously had an unhappy ending. But for a young person in the business, it was a great spot to be. 2006, 2007. But a buddy of mine who was also from the Bay Area, we were on the desk and we said, there's going to be some good opportunities on the other side of this. And so we moved back to San Francisco in 2008 and started what we hoped would be a real estate investment shop in the sort of the dark days of the GFC. It took us 3 years to actually do a deal. But for 10 or 12 years, I was a multifamily GP in San Francisco. So basically only bought old San Francisco apartment buildings, dealt with rent control. That market got a little frothy in sort of 16, 17. And so we switched over and we did some retail, we did some office, also a bit of an unhappy ending in that space as well. So I've been in on the...
Dude, you're the Grim Reaper. What's going to happen to us?
You don't want
on
to
this
hear,
podcast and then the guys died.
You don't want to hear that I'm getting into your space. So I had some good adventures in that, and then I sort of my career took a bit of a change in 2018. I left my partnership, and since then I've been what I call sort of an outsourced director of acquisition. So I'm no longer an actual GP, but for example, right now I'm sort of the third member of a partnership, still as a dumb consultant. But the two guys who are raised institutional money and are buying San Francisco multifamily. So So they get me, on the cheap because I don't need equity and don't sort of want that in my life anymore. But I have all the experience and have sat where they sat. So it's a nice setup.
That's a good gig. Awesome. One quick update on Brett for anyone listening. Brett Moss is a broker, and he just texted me and said he's got a whole bunch of 10 cap deals for sale, 10 or 11 caps. So if you would like to buy great real estate at an unbelievable price, let me know. I'll give you Brett's cell phone. He prefers text, tends to prefer them later at night. So just anyone who's listening, got some great deal flow for you, please reach out. Thank you, Brett, for that tip. So Andrew, your role, obviously you're looking for stuff to buy on behalf of this partnership. I generally don't know how many people listen to this thing, but if there are people who are they selling in San Francisco? If there's people listening who might be selling in San Francisco, what are you guys trying to buy? Are you still San Fran focused?
Yeah, it's only San Francisco multifamily at this point. What we're trying to buy is what we would call sort of mid-sized apartment buildings that are anywhere basically 10 units and up. So in San Francisco, that puts us at $2.5–3 million, and there's not really an upper bound on a price. We've been on some $15–20 million deals. In San Francisco, there's not a ton of larger deals sort of in between the 30–40 unit until you get up to the new construction side. But yeah, pretty much any neighborhood except for the Tenderloin and Skid Row, which we have crossed off. You can send those to Elliot; they're probably more up his alley. But contrary to popular belief, the entire city of San Francisco is not a zombie movie. So we found some nice spots.
My wife and I have spent some time in San Francisco.
Remains ski boot territory.
Sorry, say again.
So that would be considered ski boot territory if you're over in the Tenderloin right now.
Ski boot territory. No hat, no gloves, driving snow. That's what it's looking like in that part of town.
One of the first deals we talked about on this pod was the Phoenix Hotel, right, Eric? You remember that one? That's right.
That's in the loin.
Yeah, in the Tenderloin. Eric is a man who knows San Francisco. He's got some stories about that town.
I liked, I'd go for a ski boot over there.
Yeah. Eric likes abuse, though.
What are you doing in San Francisco, Eric, and why are you no longer doing it?
Well, I need to be in the Tenderloin. We almost did if we had the Phoenix Hotel.
Eric almost bought this deal. He was he was lathered up about it. It was this old hotel. I think it's like 30-something rooms, and it was like every rock star who played in San Francisco came through there at one point in town. Tons of history, and the pitch was, I think it was a covered land play. Like they were saying, you could rezone and build a hotel here or build office, whatever it was. And it didn't make any sense economically. I think it just didn't work. But the vibes were so strong that Eric was willing to sort of set that aside. So we're going to dig into something you've got today, multifamily deal in San Francisco. Is that right? I do think San Francisco is a great city. And I think the idea that it's sort of dead and a zombie apocalypse forever is sort of nonsense. Like every city waxes and wanes. We've talked about we've talked about Detroit on here. We've talked about New Orleans on here. We've talked about Chicago. San Fran's a great city. I'm happy it's back on the pod. I would be curious if any of that broader narrative you're seeing is impacting investors who don't work that space all the time. Like you probably don't have as much out-of-state money parachuting in the way you might have 3 or 4 years ago, but I could be totally wrong about that. So be interesting to get your thoughts on the market and how that translates into a deal that you think makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been interesting actually because I started working with this group about a year and a half ago, and they're guys who I've known for a long time, and so we've stayed in touch. And the sort of the mission when I came on was exactly that: is try to go find a group of investors or a capital partner who was willing to look through the noise of San Francisco and take a bet on it. And so let's see, what are we in end of 24? Sort of about a little over a year ago, we got our sort of pitch in San Francisco together and started chopping it, and it was almost unanimously no. And we were, we kind of got out the Rolodex, and it was the most common theme that we heard was, nope, San Francisco is a cross off. Don't care, don't want to hear about it. the city of San Francisco is off our list. Like nobody would take it to their investment committee. Nobody.
Huh.
And to be perfectly honest, the more we heard that, the more excited we got, because
Right. Yeah.
what we were selling and sort of what our story was is that is the common theme. If you read the media, obviously there are problems in San Francisco. That goes without saying. I mean, there's problems in every city, but what was not being reported was that when you get outside of ski boot territory, like the city was phenomenal. I mean, you could get into the good restaurants. There was no lines. People were moving back. The sort of the key operating partner, he's got insight into all the leasing deals, and he said, look, half of the tenants who are moving into our apartments are moving in from out of state, out of the country, which a year ago was totally contrary to the narrative. And so, yeah.
Has that impacted your ability to get what you believe to be attractive deal flow? Was that like dearth of competition or people saying no San Francisco? Did that translate into you guys finding some opportunities?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because we started buying. I think we got our first deal with this sort of setup in contract in February. That deal took forever to close, so it took 6 months to close. But even just from when we got that deal into contract to 6 months later, more money had come in. There's more groups buying. So this has been the year that San Francisco has gone from a cross-off to, local groups are coming in, even some syndicators are coming back, and we're hearing more institutional groups at least kicking the tires. And so there's been a change. Cap rates have compressed. We're now, unfortunately, we've gotten outbid on some deals in the last few months, which is frustrating, of course. But we look back at the prices what we were bidding last year when we didn't really have the capital lined up. And it was kind of a joke how low we were bidding. And we almost got some deals too. It wasn't that we were just totally lowballing everybody. So it's been a pretty interesting change over the past year.
I'm submitting some offensive offers. I'm a fan of that strategy because whatever, like there's more sellers than buyers of a lot of the product we see. So I don't know. I'll give you the square root of whatever you're asking me. And if that's not a deal, I'm going to move on.
Right.
I think that the San Francisco to me is probably maybe my favorite city in the country. And then I'll follow along with like the Union Square sales and one of the best retail districts in the world 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And to watch that sort of unfold, and you'll see these buildings, that should have, Gucci, Prada, high street retail that are now, vacant husks of
or vape shop.
Yeah. But the thing is, the pricing, it hasn't caught up. There's not screamer deals, which is also evidence of a great market, of a great city. Is everybody's like, I'm not. If you own that stuff, you're not going to give it away, and so you get this. The news is bad, maybe getting better, but the prices never got. Oftentimes, in a small or a crappy market that has bad news, the prices will far outdistance the news. And these a city like San Francisco, you might the prices come down 10%, 20%. On this retail stuff, 30%. It takes some moxie to play in those games.
Gotta have stones.
It's amazing. I don't think I really appreciated until we got into this, the amount of I call it old money that's in San Francisco. I mean, there are families that come out of the woodwork that are buying, 7-8 figure buildings, like all cash, no problem. And so those are, likely the guys who are there in Union Square saying, well, shoot, I mean, the Union Square story is fascinating because in many ways it was long overdue. People in the Bay Area, like who's driving all the way up to San Francisco, dealing with parking, even, in the good times to go to Macy's. Like there's 7 other Macy's they could go to at a suburban shopping mall. Like there's no reason for a 8-story Macy's to be downtown. And so like, the Gap, all these places, like there's not really any reason for them to be there. So as those stores have been clearing out and catching all the news, quietly some of the high end retailers are actually coming in. And so like when we went to go put this sort of the big deck together, we dug into all of this, and it was amazing how many international brands and other groups, retail groups, that are coming into Union Square, even as all the headlines are saying it's dead, everyone's clearing out. And I mean, there's, like I said, it's still a shadow of what it used to be. But there are people who are willing to bet on San Francisco for exactly what you said, Eric. It's a great city. It's not for everybody, but there's good vibes.
Good vibes. Vibes are better than returns. All right, so let's get into, give us kind of an overview of what you got. You can pull it up on the screen if you're able to, but let's talk through, like, give us the overview of the investment, why you like it, why you think it's interesting, what you do with it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll bring it up. This is actually, I would describe this location as Tenderloin adjacent. So it is
Okay.
near the Tenderloin, so it's got a little bit of
Yep.
grit to it. It's basically a 33 unit apartment building. It's just, a few blocks from Union Square. So sort of this, when downtown San Francisco is humming, you're, a 5-minute walk to the financial district, Soma, Market Street, which for the last 4 years has not been where you want to be. But if you want to bet on, downtown San Francisco coming back at some point, this would be a good location. Totally mismanaged asset, longtime owner. Of the 33 units, about half of them are actually vacant. So owner just not wanting to put money in, deferred maintenance, which again, in a city like San Francisco, vacancy is actually, can be a very good thing because, we have rent control and we do not have vacancy control. So you're allowed to re-rent a unit at market when it becomes vacant. So big value add play here, obviously if you can get it at the right price.
Sure.
The sort of the wrinkle on this deal, and they've been trying to sell this for about a year. One reason it hasn't sold is that there's 19 car parking underneath the building, but the only access to that parking, and I can show it on the screen, is through an alley behind the building, and you have to drive through a parking lot to get to the garage. And there is no easement to the benefit of the property from the parking lot. So there's like an access agreement of some kind. Which is papered, but it's questionable, in terms of how much you could actually rely on that. And then the interesting wrinkle is midway through the marketing period, that parking lot came up for sale. So now the parking lot is for sale. So that's sort of the sort of.
So you might have no parking.
Is the building? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You may have no parking, but you could also have a 50 stall surface parking lot that you could potentially buy along with this thing.
Well,
so that's sort of the intrigue.
That seems screwed up in a good way.
That's what we try to do here. Let me see if I can. Oh boy.
So with something like this, you got 15 vacant units. Presumably they need some love.
Yep.
What do you think you're going to have to put in per unit? Where do you think your rents could end up? Like, obviously the cap rate in place is going to be, a decimal point. But you've got some view to your stabilized yield on cost. It's pretty attractive. I assume for something like this, you're stabilizing north of a 7? Is that fair?
Yeah. So basically, and my screen sharing is not working right now, so I apologize about this. Let's see if I can get it working. But yeah, basically what they're asking is they're asking 7.8. So doing the math. Sorry, guys. Doing the math, it's about 230 a unit. Now, it's not worth 7.8 because it hadn't sold at 7.8. But if you sort of price it where I think it probably would sell, even if you sort of strip out the parking lot, you're probably in the mid-6s. And then, I think this one you would probably stabilize mid-7s return on cost. And I would guess you're putting in $50,000 a door on the empty units and probably about $600,000 to the building.
Okay.
So sort of at an $8 million basis, if you strip out fees and whatnot, if you don't want to include that in the basis. Now, the interesting thing about this type of building in San Francisco, we run them at sort of between 30 and 35% operating expense ratio. So quite a bit lower than bigger buildings and whatnot, which I know is very counterintuitive, but that's what it's.
How? So you guys, there's some economies of scale that you have where you have a maintenance or a leasing, some operations are centralized somewhere that allows you to bolt on smaller buildings because 33 units won't support a staff full time.
Correct.
And
or
so
you just don't do it.
Or you just don't staff it. You just let the tenant, you just give everyone a hammer and a wrench when they move in, say, fix your own shit. Good luck.
Yeah, right. I would love to. I would love to say that we have some sort of secret sauce, but that's just what these buildings run at. So the deal in California is if you have a building that's 16 units or bigger, you have to have an on-site manager. So there is somebody on site, but you basically just give them a small rent discount and you have to pay them a little bit, a few $100s a month minimum. So that is helpful for like a lot of like handyman stuff that you would have to do. But other than that, there's minimal common areas. There's no janitorial. There's very little in the way of contract services that you usually would have. You get a high rent per foot in general, even when you account for rent control. So as sort of a percentage of your operating costs, insurance is actually not that expensive. Property taxes in California are 1.2-ish%. So kind of middle of the road. And then, a lot of times, the units are metered for utilities, for gas and electric. So those costs are borne by the tenant. So the owner basically pays water and sewer, trash, and, say taxes, insurance, and property management. So depending on rents, because if you have a lot of rent controlled units, you're going to have a higher ratio. But anyway, so 30, we typically underwrite, we're probably going to take it over around 35%. And then, over as you get turnover and as we smooth out operations, get down to close to 30%.
And so your street rent is what, $3 a foot, $3.50 a foot?
So, I mean, per foot is not usually the metric we use in San Francisco, just because there's so much variety between neighborhoods. So studios in this location, is probably $2,400 even today.
Okay.
So that's doing that per foot is, and then one bedroom's like 2,800, something like that.
Right. Okay. All right. So you're a little higher than that, and then you've got rent control in place. So those numbers, the weighted average for the building will skew lower. Obviously.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so on the units that are
talk about rent control a bit.
Sure.
How obviously people know generally what it is, but it varies by market. How does it work in San Francisco? What can you do? What can't you do? What's sort of the process?
Sure. So rent control in San Francisco governs a few different things. The primary things that it governs is what type of annual rent increases you can give to a tenant. So basically the city mandates every year and says, okay, in this given year for an in-place tenant, the maximum you can raise their rent is, call it 2%. It's a portion of the CPI. And over the last 20 years, it's around 2%. So what that means is that, let's say you get a tenant in at $2,500 a month, their lease expires at the end of 12 months. You cannot give them a notice to vacate. You cannot ask them to leave. You can't, change their rent to $3,000, regardless of what's happening in the market. You can only raise the rent 2% in that case. And they can stay for the rest of their life. Like you as an owner have no ability to get them to leave.
But your expenses eventually outpace the rent, right? On a long enough timeline, the tenants become handyman against their will.
Correct. I mean, we're in contract on a building right now where someone's been there since the 80s, and on a unit that's probably a $3,000 a month unit, a tenant's paying under $500. So you get situation. Yeah. So you get to now that's a whole other situation. So that's the rent side of rent control. And you're exactly right that if you had a building that was totally rent control and nobody ever moved, you'd be hosed. Like over time, you will get taken out by operating expense creep. So that's one element of rent control, and sort of what goes along with that is eviction control, meaning you can't issue a notice to vacate, and there's only very specific reasons you can even evict a tenant, like things like violating quality of life, noise, harassment, all of these things. Like it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to get somebody out for that. Our friend of mine who runs a property manager, and he operates in San Francisco and in Oakland, and Oakland has very similar rent control. I mean, he's got some stories, it sound like the stories, Elliot, that you have in your buildings, but he can't do anything. He can barely get the police to come, let alone get somebody out if they're, knifing and stabbing and shooting people. Like, there's not much you can do.
But here's the difference. Elliot doesn't call the police.
Yeah, I actually had one squatter saying I'm going to call the police, and I handed him my phone and said, go ahead. And they also know the cops aren't coming.
I think we can settle this right here.
Yeah, go ahead. All right, so that sounds
hellish.
That sounds like an insane business.
So So it's insane. Let me give you a
What are you
couple.
doing, man?
Let me give you a couple of data points on why.
Give this guy some ski boots.
You have to have a whole closet full of ski boots to operate in San Francisco. But actually, I mean, all kidding aside, what's interesting about San Francisco in particular right now, the pandemic cleared out so many people. Like so many people left San Francisco. Looking at data from the rent registry that San Francisco has, they spend like $5 million a year and do absolutely nothing with the data, which is typical of San Francisco. Something like 65% of all tenants have moved in the last 5 years. So there's this sort of, and basically, if you look at the data, it's like 10% or fewer of all tenants in San Francisco have been there longer than I think 15 years. So the percentage of buildings that have really long-term entrenched tenants is pretty low. And most tenants who move in now are moving out within the first 5 years of their tenancy. And so now, of course, you don't know that, and you're taking a bit of a flyer, and it's all priced in, right? I mean, you have a $500, a month unit. You're not pricing that assuming that they're going to move. You price it assuming you're going to get $500, and so it just lowers your basis. And then if they move, I mean, it's a huge value pop, and it's one reason why San Francisco and New York, of course, has problems with people trying to push out these long-term tenants because there's millions of dollars of value trapped in a unit like that.
And so how can you push them out? Like, are you allowed to offer them money to move, or is even that frowned upon? Like, you can say, I'll give you 50 grand if you get out.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when we started in this and sort of right after the GFC, it was a bit more of the Wild West. Like we did a lot of tenant buyouts, and like we took a bit of a different approach because most owners, when they do a tenant buyout, they basically just send the tenant a letter that's usually from their attorney that says, here you go, would you like 50 grand to move? And most people say no. But what we would do is we actually went and we sat in the tenant's living room and would give them the offer verbally, get to know them, try to develop a rapport. Now it didn't, obviously we give it to them in writing too, and it didn't always work, but you'd be surprised. You get to know somebody a little. I mean, we paid somebody, I think 120 grand to leave. She was paying $900 a month in a unit that we ended up renovating and leasing for $6,500. So, that's, doing the math, that's like, call it 800 grand or $1 million in value that we spent 200K to renovate. Now you got to adjust it a little bit. And she took the money and went and bought a house.
All right. I look, that's a good success story for her, I guess. But doesn't that seem like maybe a weird or broken system?
Oh, it's
that
totally
renters
broken. It's totally
get to, like, I don't want to say extort landlords, but that they're put in this position where it's like, I'm not leaving. It costs you more to operate this property than I'm paying you in rent, and you have to give me money to get out. That's a tough one for me to kind of get behind. That seems like the government is sort of shifting the responsibility of social housing onto landlords against their will.
And if I stay long enough and my friends stay long enough, the building becomes a slum.
Right. There's like this correct mix of legacy tenants where it's still a nice building, but there's a tipping point where if you have too many legacy tenants, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, and there's
I assume.
So you got both sides of the equation playing chicken. I'm going to buy this building and own it,
you want
and
to
hope that you move out. And then if you're on the other side of the equation, I'm going to sit here till you strangle. But if you do strangle, I'm living in a shithole.
It's like that story, the parable about the like scorpion riding on the back of the frog as they cross the river. And like the scorpion is like thinking, well, what if I kill the frog, but then I drown? And the frog's thinking, well, if I just go underwater, I drown the scorpion will probably kill me first. And you never really know how it ends, like who gets to land safely. But I do envision like it's the tenant and the landlord in this really dicey game of chicken.
And I will tell you, to be perfectly honest, here's the worst part of it. The worst part of it is that what ends up happening a lot of the time is that tenants, they're sitting on an asset, right? Because, all being aside, they have a leasehold interest in this apartment, right? And that has a value. And so in theory, in the success story I told, a tenant could monetize that and then go do something with that money. But what ends up happening is that there's so many tenants' rights organizations who don't want to see that happen because they view even a at-will buyout as pushing people out and gentrification, all this stuff. They will go and advocate to the tenant that they shouldn't take the money. And so, for example, there's one way around. Elliot, you asked about how could you force them out. There's something on the books called the Ellis Act, which allows an owner to legally vacate an entire building. And so you can come in if you buy, this, 33 unit building, there's 15 tenants. You can come in and do an Ellis Act eviction and kick everybody out. You got to pay people relocation, and I think you can't release the unit for any of the units for 5 years, so it's got to sit vacant for 5 years. Ton of neighborhood blowback.
Why?
Right?
Why 5 years?
It's a way to make it punitive to do that. It's expensive, right? But what ends up happening in these situations is it becomes your game of chicken. So the landlord comes in and says, "I'm going to Ellis Act the building," and we bought an 8-unit building right next to another 8-unit building owned by this. Then we watched the buyer try to go through this Ellis Act. We've never done it, and so it ends up the owner says, "Look, I'm going to Ellis Act the eviction, Ellis Act the building," and the tenants say, "Well, you got to pay us, $50,000 or $100,000 each to leave," and the owner's like, "No, I'm going to pay 50," and so. Usually those get resolved by buyouts and even not even buying out everybody. You buy out half the tenants and it's fine. But then these landlord or tenants' rights groups come in and they start telling the tenants to, "No, you got to fight it. You got to fight it. We're going to make it a public cause. We're going to go to the press." And so these tenants get dragged through this like multi-year horrible process. I mean, their lives are totally disrupted. I mean, it's very common. And at the end of the day, they usually just say, "Out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. Right. This is my home." And so it creates these really weird dynamics. Rent control is one of those things that it's sort of the fact that it even exists. And at this point, I don't know how you're ever going to get rid of it. But yeah, it creates really strange dynamics, and it does not help a housing market at large.
There's cities we won't buy in, and we won't buy in cities with rent control just for that reason that life is hard enough. We have enough brain damage. Affordable housing is brutal. You, by the way, without knowing it, you're probably cut out for affordable housing because you weirdly like this horrible existence. DC has this Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act called TOPA, and we'll probably dig into this on a different episode. But basically, with TOPA, when a building is sold, if Eric and I negotiate a contract in good faith, we agree on a purchase price. Our contract is shared with the tenants, and the tenants have like 90 days or 180. They have some period where the tenants can opt to buy it. Or there's these tenant advocacy groups and attorneys who specialize in like organizing the tenants, because you also have to post your contract publicly, and the tenants can assign their right to a different developer. So Eric and I work for a year to figure out a deal. Tenants step in. Some attorney's like, "No, you don't want Elliot to buy it. You want to sell it to Andrew. He's my buddy, and he'll do a great job with the building." And so there's this whole black market of like attorneys steering tenants to their preferred developers and getting a kickback for it. And the whole thing is, and it doesn't actually end up benefiting the tenants. And I don't know, like, who thought we're going to, it's a 300 unit Section 8 project. We're just going to let the tenants of the Section 8 project somehow get if you've ever tried to organize 8 people on a ski trip or a vacation for the summer, it's nearly impossible. You try and organize 300 people to buy a property and figure out complex finance. It never happens. It's just this wacky thing. That type of regulation has always been, I think, well-meaning, but crafted by people who fundamentally don't understand just like economics and supply and demand. So the San Francisco thing seems similar in that way.
I know, and once it's in place, it's not going anywhere. Like there's nobody seriously advocating to get rid of rent control in San Francisco. They just in the most recent ballot tried to expand it to include new buildings, and also wipe off the books in all of California, one of the primary landlord protections, and that didn't pass. Even in California, it didn't pass. But there's no way they're going to wipe it off the books. But the other reason I love it is that, exactly as you said, Eric, that you end up with these buildings that owners can't maintain, which means that if you actually come in and buy a building, and we just leased out a unit that paints the story. If you look at the comps, most of the comps, like the rental comps in this market, one bedrooms for $2,800, not renovated, pretty crappy units. If you go and actually renovate a unit, you can put it on the market for $3,200 or $3,300, and you get the door knocked down because people make a lot of money in San Francisco. They want to live out in these neighborhoods. and there's literally no supply. And so there's no renovated supply in a lot of these neighborhoods. People are paying 25% or below of their income on rent. So they're sort of happy to pay it, and it works. And so as messed up as it is, it's a tremendous barrier to entry. It keeps the inventory of actual real competing apartments down. You have these sort of every once in a while somebody decides to up and move that you didn't expect, or takes a buyout, and you get these nice value pops you didn't expect. And then you just have to have a tremendous aptitude for dealing with bureaucracy and frustration and paperwork, and away you go. It sounds right up your eye.
It does, yeah.
The book that I recommend probably more than any is this one called Systematics by this guy, John Galt. And he goes through and talks about the basic premise of it is complex systems have the opposite effect of their intended outcome. So, all this bullshittery that was set up to create, safe and affordable housing through these processes ends up having the inverse effect. And he's got just like these most ridiculous examples after example. But one of the best one was there was NASA was concerned about their rockets rusting. And so they built this huge warehouse somewhere in Florida, like 20 acres under a roof, put all these rockets in it. That would keep it out of the weather and protect them. But and you imagine what all that took to create, design, build, all the meetings and all the stuff. They build the thing, but the building was so big that it created its own weather system within it. And they couldn't do anything with the air conditioning to keep it dry. And so it started having precipitation inside the building, bringing like rain down on all the rockets and rusting them out even more. Anyway, that's kind of what's going on here. It sounds like.
It sounds a little bit like what's going on here. We
always got 5 minutes to get to a deal.
Yeah, I was going to. Well, that's funny you say that. I was about to say we always ask. We go around the horn and say, "Are you a buyer or not?" I can already speak for Eric. Eric is not a buyer. We've been doing this long enough. Eric is not buying any of this. I can't believe I'm going to say this. I might be. It sounds like the truly horrible way to make a buck that I'd be interested in. The boots are
small enough that they have an appeal.
Yeah, right. The ski boots are so tight that I'm actually interested. I'm not. We're not going to expand into San Francisco, but the general premise of like a weird thing and a totally inefficient market and a really wacky system. I do not intend to compete with you, but I do understand the appeal of working a market like that, and only a market like that. This is one of the reasons we get deals sometimes in California, we get deals in New York. People send us stuff from all over. We don't go into these types of markets and just sort of parachute in because, one, if I'm seeing the deal, it means 10,000 buyers have passed who know that market. But two, let's say I oddly am seeing the deal and one of the first few people, we just don't know enough to execute with conviction. Like if you and I were bidding on a deal together, you, I'm sure would say, or if I was buying a deal from you, you'd be like, this dude is about to get smoked. Like he just doesn't know. He has forgotten about this thing. He's assumed 9 of the 10 things will go his way, but he doesn't know the 10th, which is a widowmaker, is coming for him. And so those kinds of markets are attractive, I think, if you work them, develop expertise, which sounds like you have. So I fundamentally understand why you would be in this space, but man, I'm a buyer on principle, but I'm not actually a buyer of this deal.
Fair enough. I get it. I sort of got myself going down the road of affordable housing about 3 years ago. And so I met some people who are in the development business, and I got far enough to know that I was like, okay, this is another similar business where there's just huge information mode, a network of people, and I'm just not going to do it again. I've spent the last 10, 15 years doing it one time. I know how much pain you have to go through and how many stupid mistakes you have to do to get there. And, but I get it. I totally get it.
I think the other thing about this deal, the one thing that, there's all these complexities and all this other stuff, but the one thing that got my attention was starting out was with this easement. And anything that has like, because we've been on both sides of these kind of deals, any kind of deal that has the potential of a binary outcome, like something happens or doesn't happen. And if it does happen, you're smoked. There's enough of a chance that does that, just like if you can just avoid those, because some percentage of them, you're going to get smoked.
Yeah, every morning is like Schrodinger's cat, where you wake up and you are either getting richer or about to be bankrupt. And you just don't know until you open the box. But there's no certainty from when you go to bed to when you wake up the next morning that this deal is not suddenly going to eat your lunch.
One day there's going to be a chain across that parking deck.
Yeah.
And you're going to get a call from the tenants saying, hey, I can't get to my spaces.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think this deal, if you decided to take on the parking lot as well, and the parking lot is, just as a standalone deal is interesting, but I would agree with you. I think even if you bought the deal assuming no parking, like no parking income, then if all of a sudden you don't have access, now you've got a whole freaking basement that you can barely get into, and so then it's just a cost even to get to break even. But that's the thing. San Francisco is the reverse of the cat, because you wake up every morning and you say, oh, shoot, one of my long-term tenants may have decided to move today. And so you never know. It's the reverse.
Yeah. Or the government decides to make your life harder. Every day is a new day.
There is that. There is some of that as well.
Yeah. Well, this has been a ton of fun, Andrew. I appreciate it. I'm glad you came on. I like talking through this kind of weird stuff.
Sure.
I don't know if you guys have any final thoughts, but I've enjoyed this one tremendously.
I don't think Brett gets his mind around this one.
No, Brett's not a buyer.
No, it sounds too hard for him. But definitely,
yeah. Brett's a man built for an easy path.
Yeah.
All right, gents. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, guys. This is fun.